I think so. The desserts need an oasis of clapping. So let's have a big round of applause for them. Welcome, sir. Joining us, Mr. M. Damodaran, former chairman, SEBI. Can we have a round of applause for sir? And of course, we have our moderator, Mr. Janmejaya Sinha, chairman, Boston Consulting Group, Asia Pacific. Over to you, sir.
So, the chairmans have one power, and I'm going to exercise this as we start. And I'm going to change the topic a little bit. So we will talk about reimagining governance. Can principles and trust replace rules? Dogmatism, as Mr. Damodaran was telling me, goes into dogma and why dogma has anything to do with governance, we really need to think about. But nonetheless, I just decided let's change it. So we'll talk about can principles and trust replace rules. Now, the other good thing about being a moderator is that you get to ask the questions. And it's really very liberating. And both with Mr. Damodaran and Mr. Vikram Mehta here, there are people who really know a lot about governance. And I don't. So it's a perfect situation that I'll both learn and challenge. So let me begin with you, Mr. Damodaran, and ask you, what is governance and how can it be reimagined?
What is governance is arguably the most difficult question that you can pose to anyone in a post-lunch session, especially as the first question. I think at one level it represents an intention to play by the rules, to treat all persons equally in similar circumstances, to ensure that business is not conducted in a manner consistent with the interests of some stakeholders and not consistent with the interests of other stakeholders.
So let me come to you, Vikram, and ask you, as the chair of Brookings Institute, when you look at governance across countries, how does India compare?
I think the answer has to be given at two levels. One is, and I'm just picking up on the word imagining and reimagining. The first answer should be as to whether or not our governance structure has been built on an imagined past, and whether or not the current imagining of our governance structure is reflective of the realities of our ecosystem. And the second question that we need to ask is whether or not the governance structure that we have compares not necessarily well or poorly with regard to other societies and other systems, but whether or not the future governing structure will indeed meet the expectations of the society that is emerging in India. So I'm not going to necessarily respond specifically to the question, how does our governance structure compare to other governance structure? But I will say that the presumption has been that we have had an imagined governing structure that has been reflective of society. The topic that we have today is asking whether or not the existing governing structure is reflective of the society that we have now and are expected to see develop in the future. And I think that's more important because the reason why today we have so many challenges in the corporate sort of community is perhaps because our governing structure is simply not in line with the changes that have taken place across our political, social, demographic, and economic spheres in India.
Tell me more.
Well, let's look at the past for the moment. Firstly, let's just make it very clear that governance and reimagining governance is a capacious topic. As I said, reimagining presumes that there was an imagined past and that there is a future, and a present, sorry. Now, in the past, if one really wanted to take this discussion further, we could say that our leaders who brought us independence had an imagination of an India that was liberal, democratic, secular, and this imagination was given concrete expression in our constitution. Jawaharlal Nehru had an imagination of an economic model that was statist, driven by the state, that was centralized, but a mixed economy. Now, over the years, this imagination has changed. Imagination is a cognitive process. It's not a finite issue. It changes as time changes, as realities change, as circumstances demand. And our constitution has changed, has been amended on several occasions. Our economic model went through a radical transformation in 1992. So today, the real issue is whether or not this time has come for us to reimagine our governance structure right across all domains, and within that governance structure, how do we place corporate governance? And I think that is the big issue. And if you want me to elaborate that further, I think we are seeing today in India many conflicts, contradictions, fault lines, paradoxes. We are a young society, but the society still clashes with a somewhat cautious, precedent-bound, rule-bound state. We are a multi-ethnic, pluralist society that, in one sense, demands layered and decentralized governance, but what we see all around us is a trend towards centralization and authoritarianism. We have very solidly embedded the hardware of democracy, through elections, through the ID card, but the software of democracy, the institutions of judiciary, bureaucracy, the legislature have been eroded. The point I'm trying to make is that there is a conflict, there are fault lines, there are clashes, and our governance structure now must be able to reflect not just these fault lines, but the emergent consequences of these fault lines.
So let me come to you, Mr. Damodaran. You were chairman of SEBI, and at a time you were actually trying to bring a certain consistency in our corporate governance, both within India, bringing, I recall, distinctly you talking about a level playing field, which was necessary for corporates within India, and also in some type of consonance with the world at large. So I'm going to ask you, there is two levels of this question. If you take periods of history, between 1950 and 2000, the US went from being a $1.5 trillion economy to a $10 trillion economy. And in 15 years, from 2000 to 2015, China went from being a $1 trillion economy to being a $10 trillion economy. So in 15 years, they basically covered what the US, which was one of the fastest growers in human history, did in 50 years. The corporate governance in China and governance as such in China is very disparate from Western liberal democracies. So when you reflect on our movement and our path forward, what are the contradictions that you see, and how do you contrast them with what Vikram was saying?
Let me touch on, let me touch on a point that Vikram made. He was talking about the structure of governance. even if you leave the structure as it is and breathe some life into it, redefine the content of governance. You can have the best structure in place and use that structure which was well-intentioned. I'm sure that the Constitution, the people that framed them had the best interests of the nation at heart. You can use that structure to provide for economic domination of some people, increase disparities, and you'll be still playing by the rule, whatever the framework envisaged. I would focus more on the content of governance. What is it that you're seeking to do? Have you identified the problems that the country faces? If you've identified the problems, are the solutions that you're seeking to put in place addressing the disease or fixing the symptoms? Because often what happens is we are responding to symptoms. And when we respond to symptoms, the problem is getting worse. I don't want to stay with that analogy for too long, but to respond to the question that you made, progress of China in terms of sheer numbers, we need to step back and ask ourselves, what is progress? Is progress earning a little more money? Is progress doing much better than your neighbor because you were positioned in circumstances to do better than him? You exploited a context, you exploited an inequality of relationships and therefore benefited, and then you tell yourself that, I have progressed, this guy hasn't. At the level of the nation, progress is when everybody progresses. Not everybody will progress equally. You also need to build into it something that is missing, which a much smaller country has attempted. Are people happy? Is there an index of happiness by which you look at progress? Now, I look at governance as a means to an end. What is that end? Most of the people should be happier tomorrow than they were today. Most of the people should be marginally better off tomorrow than they were today. They don't have to be exponentially better off. Some will, of course, do that. If that happens, I believe we should have reasonable comfort with what is in place. What China can do, we will never do, because we've heard this times without number, that we are a noisy, vibrant democracy. I don't know whether we are more noisy or more vibrant, but you tend to hear both of these together and wonder, what is democracy? Is it about being noisy? Is it about being vibrant? I don't have the answer to that question. Someday we will discover that as we go along. What I think is important, and I'm going back to the proposition which you, using your position as the moderator, rightly amended, I must compliment you. You took dogma out of the equation and brought in rules. I think we need to tell ourselves this very clearly. This rules versus principles is a very sterile debate. Rules are presumably based on some principles. They are an exposition of principles, but stated in a manner where you visit it with some rigidity which is on occasions avoidable. Principles can't exist by themselves, because if you just say that these are the broad principles, it will be subject to interpretation. And especially in our country, just look at our Constitution. Our Constitution is now several decades old. We are still interpreting it. Then we are importing concepts from other countries like UK, where they've managed without a written constitution all these years. So we need to see our genius for creating doubts where perhaps none exists, then attempting to interpret it and enriching lawyers in the process, spending disproportionate time of a judiciary which should be looking at other issues, interpreting matters which at best are of academic interest. We need to revisit some of these things. I think the real issue is, are we being exceedingly prescriptive? We are not allowing enough room for people to work within a very rigid framework? Or have we moved to this fictional element called light touch regulation, which to my mind is no regulation? When you talk in terms of light touch regulation, you're signaling to people, do what you like. I might catch you, should I feel so inclined, but otherwise you're free to do what you like. This light touch regulation hasn't got anyone anywhere. Look at what 2008 did. Till 2008, we looked at the US as a very prescriptive rules-based regime. You looked at UK as principle-based. Then one weekend, Northern Rock folded up. After Northern Rock folded up, the UK wrote arguably the longest regulation there was, just to respond to one episode of failure. So then they had abandoned the so-called principles-based regulation. The US, on the other hand, is today talking, whether it is because the president is so inclined, is talking in terms of principles-based regulation. You must have rules, you must have principles. And I'll make one more point. I was a member of a delegation before the Financial Stability Board was constituted. It was an informal arrangement called the Financial Stability Forum. I was the only Asian in that. So in the morning, there were about 10 of us, and we had 10 or 12 of the top CEOs of the US meeting us to discuss exactly the issue we are debating today. Why should you have rules? Why should you be too prescriptive? Can you not have regulations that just state the spirit and leave it to us to operate? It was a good conversation. Some of the top names were there. In the afternoon, the compliance officers of these same 10 guys came and met us. And they told us the exact opposite. They said, we don't care about principles. You tell us exactly what we need to do. Because should things go wrong, it is our heads that will be on the chopping block, not the guys that you saw in the morning. They will then turn around and say, why did you get this wrong? I have the regulator breathing down my neck. So you tell us exactly what you need us to do. Don't leave scope for interpretation on our part or your part. Whereas the people that are at the higher levels of the organization will tell you, why are you writing all of this? Give us principles. There is a problem within organizations in terms of what you need. You can't swing to one extreme and say, I will not be prescriptive at all. On the other hand, you can't have a system that is excessively prescriptive, and I'll tell you something which you are more familiar with than I am. When the Ghosh committee wrote out the recommendations on how to prevent frauds in banks, I don't know whether many of you in the audience know that before the Ghosh committee came, we did not have to give photographs to the banks when opening accounts. It was the Ghosh committee that said you need to give photographs when you open bank accounts. Do you know you had people writing into the Reserve Bank at that point of time and to the ministry, how many copies of photographs do we need to give? They needed to be told that. The committee only said you need to give photographs. But there were people saying, tell us how many copies so that we are fully compliant. We don't ask for one and you don't turn around and tell us you should have got 3 copies, one to paste on the application form, one to keep somewhere else, and the third one perhaps to look at to see whether your customer is good looking. I don't know for what the third copy is used anyway. People want to be told that. That's the climate in which we have grown up. To move away in a disruptive fashion saying, no, I'll write out in just 5 lines what you need to do, and the rest of it you interpret, you're going to invite a problem.
Vikram, let me change that question a bit and bring it right down to corporate governance. Why is it that there are more occasions than not when somebody could be following the rules but fail the sunshine test? So you are completely compliant, and yet everyone feels that you are not. How big of an issue is that, and why does it occur?
You know, Janmejaya, you're in business, you advise business. I've been in business for 30 years. Mr. Damodaran has regulated business. And I think you'll agree that, and I'm sure all of us, and all of you in the audience, that almost every corporate, sensible, reputable corporate, makes broadly the same set of statements about their values. They all say that they will be principled, that they will follow rules, that they will be supportive of stakeholders and not just focus on the shareholders, that whilst profits are important and are necessary for them to be able to afford principles and rules, any company that does not abide by principles does not deserve the profits. These are some timeless sort of statements that are made by everyone. And then when it comes, when the push comes to shove, we have scandals after scandals after scandals in the press. And yes, the PNB is the latest, and there are many others. And the question really is why, as you put it. Now, one can have many explanations, but one of the reasons why I sort of made the comments I made in my first opening remark about the ecosystem, the corporate governance, the broad governance ecosystem in this country, of which corporate governance is only a part, is because corporate governance corporates don't function in a vacuum. They function within the larger political, economic, social domain of which they're a part. And one has to ask this question: why is it that so often the rhetoric of principles is mismatched or out of sync with the actual actions of the corporate leaders? And I think the answer lies really fundamentally in the nature of our polity. And very simply put, if an example, if politicians today need money to run their elections, there is no getting away from that. You can be the most principled politician in this country, but if you have to approach 1 million people to get re-elected, you need large dollops of cash. Who is going to finance you? It's going to be the corporates. That money that you get from corporates may not go into your own pocket, but puts you in hock to the wealthy. So on one hand, the corporates might have principles, but on the other hand, they are in hock with the politicians, and politicians are in a nexus with the corporates. So when push comes to shove, the ecosystem is that politicians do, in fact, pressure the corporates. Now, that is something that we just simply cannot escape from unless we begin to reimagine the political and economic, you might say, structures of our country. And who's going to reimagine it? It's not going to be the elite who have a vested interest in the status quo. It's not going to be the corporates. It's not going to be the political leaders. It's not going to be you and me, frankly. Because in many respects, you and me are actually beneficiaries of the status quo. It's going to be the very people who are, in some senses, disenfranchised by the existing system. It's going to be the people who are outside the orbit of the current system. Those are the people who are going to have to reimagine our future. And it's that reimagining that's going to bring to us, you bring a match between rhetoric and action. So whilst I think I have great respect for individual leaders, I have great respect for corporate boards, I'm on several myself, I still wonder whether we are asking ourselves the right question about the existing rules as presumed or as set within the existing structure. It really requires us to ask a very different set of questions. What is required to break the stranglehold of the elites in India that will then enable the governing structure to actually reimagine a future that is responsive to the demands and expectations of an emergent India that is young, dynamic, aspirational, where technology is now the culture, where economic development is a national narrative. That's, I think, what we need to do, is to look beyond the existing framework in order to reimagine our future.
Okay, so let me now provide what I've been wanting to do, but I wanted to, in every debate, because Indian classical music teaches us, you need the alap to set the mood. And now I'm going to ask the question that I've been dying to ask both of you. And this time you all will have to answer just the question I'm asking. The question I'm asking is, today I disagree with you, Vikram, that the corporates pay for elections. They don't, not one penny. The people who pay for elections are India's depositors. Everything that is paid for in India today is paid for by the Indian depositor. And the way this works is actually very elegant, and it has worked since since 1969 in this brilliantly elegant manner. You nationalize banks, so no one suspects that there will be a run on a bank. Then you expand branches and collect deposits. You take these deposits and you give them to the government for their plan. Priority sector are paying interest groups. And then corporates get money from these depositors, which are from public sector banks, and they share a little bit with the politician. And because this is a soft budget constraint, because depositors are available to deposit their money and they don't fear a run on the bank, in this structure, till you have government ownership of bank, which takes away the depositor's need to understand the basic strength of a bank, corporate governance is basically weakened in India. So do we need a change in structure of our banking to be able to enforce better corporate governance? Mr. Damodaran.
If you're talking about ownership of banks, I'm convinced that this country, given its heterogeneity, the diversity on several fronts, including the economic front, needs public sector banks. Today, tomorrow, perhaps forever, I don't know. But if you're talking in terms of how the system is manipulating the depositor to be the one that ultimately finances all of it, the solution is very simple. Allow one bank to fail. When is the last time you allowed a bank that was big enough to fail? Forget public sector banks. The Bank of Sikkim had, if memory serves me right, when it was merged with the Union Bank of India, the Bank of Sikkim had 96% NPAs. Now, all of what you're reading in the papers, NPAs have become, very large, 5%, 7% banks are going through the tube. They said 96%. When the persons running that bank challenged this in the court, and this number was placed before the court, one of the judges asked, what happened to the other 4%? Why did they let that go? That was the response from the bench which was hearing it. Did we allow that bank to fail? We didn't allow that bank to fail. We merged that also. So long as there is a perception that a scheduled commercial bank will not fail, the theory is that you only have 100,000 rupees deposit insurance. But then government ownership at one level, you see government ownership as being the backstop. Forget deposit insurance. Government will not allow a public sector bank to fail. We haven't allowed a private sector bank to fail in this country. They've been merged with somebody or the other. Global Trust Bank. Global Trust Bank had failure written all over it in the first few years of its existence. You didn't allow that to fail. It was a private sector bank. You held a gun to the head of the OBC and said, you were telling us you wanted to grow bigger. Here is a bank, you take it. And they did not even get enough time to do due diligence on what they were taking. If you allow a bank to fail, then depositors will start looking at the safety of the bank. Now, the only banks that fail are the cooperative banks. And in any case, many of them shouldn't have existed in the first place, so no tears are being shed for them rightly. But allow one bank of significance to fail, the system will become much better. Today, 11 banks, which constitute a majority in terms of numbers of the public sector banks, are under prompt corrective action. I know you have a soft corner for the Reserve Bank of India. I too worked for 11 months in the Reserve Bank of India. But I asked myself this, and I've gone public with this. If 11 banks that you have regulated are today under the prompt corrective action regime, should the Reserve Bank of India not be under the prompt corrective action regime? Don't you need to fix that first? Because you failed hopelessly. The Narasimham Committee said, set up a board for financial supervision independent of the Reserve Bank with only the governor at the top as the common. You haven't implemented that. You have commonality of directorships. I'm talking about a few years ago. Commonality of directorships between the Reserve Bank of India and the bank stroke institutions that they regulate. members of the RBI board who are on the boards of private sector banks have sat on the board for financial supervision and looked at the inspection reports and have had a second round of inspections done, hoping that better results will emerge if you send in another team of inspectors. If you don't address those conflicts, the depositor will continue to carry the can. He has no choice.
Do you agree with Mr. Damodaran?
Yes, of course. I
So
think
you
that
agree that we need public sector banks?
no. Look, I'm not.
Now I'm going to have fun.
I'm not. I think when Mrs. Indira Gandhi nationalized the banks, the political, social, economic context was perhaps compelling her to take that decision. Today, it's very clear that the public sector banks are a choke on economic growth and economic development. And I completely agree with Mr. Damodaran that we need to now restructure the banks. We need to allow a bank to fail. Perhaps that will alter the nature of governance of not just the banking sector, but also the public sector itself. But this goes back, you see, if I may just take it one step further, Janmejaya, what we are doing right now in this conversation is focusing on the past. And I think all of us have articulated, whether now or in our drawing rooms, and despaired about what's wrong with our country. What we need to do is to now look forward. You know, Klaus Schwab, the WEF president, and you and Mr. Damodaran probably been to Davos many times. I haven't. I've been there once. He wrote that book, or that small pamphlet called The Fourth Industrial Revolution, and in which he, if I recollect, he talked about the fusion of the digital, the biological, and the physical revolutions, and suggested that corporates now need to really revamp their organizations. They need to look at their processes to overcome or meet the challenges of this new meet the challenge of the fourth industrial revolution. My own view is that, you know, time has come for all of us to be thinking about perhaps a fourth political revolution, you know, that succeeds, if you go back 2,000 years, tribalism, feudalism, and today, maybe the liberal sort of Western democratic order. We need to ask ourselves, what is the political, geopolitical, political, economic, social, political, economic order that will most effectively answer the sort of challenges that we are talking about here? It's not going to happen if we just try and sort this problem out within the existing framework. The existing political framework, socio-political framework in our country will allow us to perhaps improve what we are already doing. It will be an evolutionary process. So if one bank fails, if one public sector bank fails, it might improve the financial sort of efficiencies in the economy. If the Companies Act, the Indian Companies Act has been changed, and we all know now as independent directors on boards how alert we are to our role. It was probably not the case 15 years ago. And one can certainly talk about evolutionary changes. But push comes to shove. Is that really going to reimagine our future in the way that we need to reimagine it? Is it going to really actually deliver the expectations that 70% of our country are looking for to be delivered? And I don't think so. So we're talking about a new world. We're talking about a world that is exploding with data. We need to find a system by which we use that data intelligently. We're talking about a world that has global problems, whether it's climate change, global warming, whether it's terrorism, whether it's sectarianism. These are problems that do not respect national boundaries. We need a solution that will allow individuals and sectors to collaborate across national boundaries. We need to actually recognize that whilst markets are important, they're like fingers, they're nimble, they're dexterous. We also need the role of governments. Governments is like the thumb, which is like a countervailing, it's not so subtle, but it's a countervailing force to the greed of the market. But we need a very different model. So looking forward, Janmejaya, rather than looking back, I'm asking myself the question. I don't have the answer, but I certainly say when someone says reimagine governance, I'm saying, yes, firstly, is there a need to reimagine? And that means that today's imagined present is insufficient. So yes, we do need to reimagine the future.
Okay,
How
so
do we do so?
let me then, let me just frame this before I go to the audience. We have a little bit more time than that watch shows. The question that I'm going to ask is totally about governance and the future. Somebody recently, about a year ago, told me that your only privacy is somebody else's disinterest. Your only privacy is somebody else's disinterest. So in a world where there is complete transparency, because you actually cannot have privacy, what should be the nature of governance going forward?
Do you see privacy, I'm sorry I'm asking you a question, do you see privacy as some kind of an impediment in the journey of governance?
No, what I feel is that there was an earlier model, an understanding of what governance was, and it was a model which expected people to behave in certain ways, which were normative, which were established. But everyone was allowed their privacy. And constitutions in different countries allowed you the fifth and others so that you could not incriminate yourself. The nature of life today is such that everyone is on a smartphone or is getting there. And everything on a smartphone is actually public. So in fact, you cannot hide. And if you expect that everything will be public, then what should be the nature of governance? Because anything that becomes public gets the scrutiny. So the nature of governance itself has to evolve with this new reality. Okay.
When you say everything that is in public gets scrutiny, I want to amend that to say everything that is in public is capable of getting scrutiny.
You're exactly.
But then again, you pick and choose what is it that, let's say, the state as big brother is looking at. What is it that your neighbor is looking at? And in some sense, when you actually use some of the modern technology and the instruments that are available to us, you are saying I am willing to give up some elements of my privacy. If I've safeguarded privacy is a right, the Supreme Court has said so, but it's not a right that is unrestricted. It is a right that maybe in public interest you will tend to circumscribe on occasion. That balance is still being worked out. But governance will certainly benefit if there is more information in the public domain. Whether more private information in the public domain will translate to better governance is something that you need to ask yourself. But if you allow me, I want to go back to what Vikram said, which is imagining the future. The future clearly is bankless banking. We moved to branchless banking. Now we will move to bankless banking. You don't need banks for banking. Because if you go back to the original definition of banking, which is the acceptance of deposits for the purpose of lending or investment, you don't need the bank to be in between. You are seeing other people do it. Is the future cryptocurrency? Is the future, because cryptocurrency again was a response to regulatory failures of 2008. Is cryptocurrency the answer? We seem to be not saying so yet, but in Japan you can make payments using cryptocurrencies, bitcoins or whatever else you want to. That's something that I don't think you'll be able to stop. So if that's going to be part of our future, let's put whatever safeguards are required in place and then bring that in, rather than take this position, it's not legal tender. You're not saying that its existence is illegal. You're saying it's not legal tender. So it's hanging there in space. It is a commodity you can acquire, but you cannot use it to pay. Then what is that? Are we in some sense getting back to the barter system where you don't need any of this? So I think there must be some boldness. There must be some recognition of what other countries have done. Maybe learn from their mistakes. I'm not saying you shouldn't learn from their mistakes. Experience is not a name you give to your own mistakes. Even the mistakes of other people count for experience. So taking all of that on board, put in place a system that addresses the needs of the future, and who in any case are the customers. As Vikram said rightly, it's young people. The way they look at the world, and rightly, is different. They bring a lot of energy, enthusiasm, excitement, and two things which I regard as hugely positive, which is impatience and irreverence. So all these together is the set of people that are actually making demands on your system. If the system doesn't measure up, if it doesn't reinvent itself, then there's a huge disconnect that will play out to the disadvantage of all of us.
Could I take a few questions from the audience? Yes, sir. Could you just give your name and ask your question?
My name is Divakar Prakash. My question is, there seems to be an economic paradox prevailing in India. On one hand, we have perennial growth rate of like 6 to 8% year on year. And on the other hand, there are a lot of people staying under poverty line, like it's more than 200 million people. So what would be your impact strategy to make a sustainable economic reforms?
But the session is a bit on governance. Let me correct a few more.
It is related to governance.
Okay.
Yeah, Mr. Damodaran, you were being a regulator and we have been to UTI, it has a very bad experience for the people. And nowadays, government has a proposal to merging of the banking system. Do you think it's going to help the people or it's going to help the government or it's just making fool of us?
No, I didn't get your question.
Merging of banking, is it making a fool of us?
No, if you merge two weak banks, you will get one huge weak bank. That's not the answer. You got to clean up the system first. Now, some banks are weak, some are, let's say, I'm not saying banks are strong, some are less weak. But the less weak bank, if that is seen as big brother and you merge the other bank into that, you're bringing in a problem, and we've seen any evidence of that. Those of you who live in Delhi, Punjab National Bank is now in the news for all the wrong reasons. Part of the problem of Punjab National Bank, which is not being acknowledged by anyone now, is that New Bank of India was thrust down its throat some years ago. The New Bank of India and the Punjab National Bank were two completely different types of banks. It took a while for PNB to absorb those people, their practices, the way they approached work, and it's not fully recovered from that even now. I bank with PNB even now. I'm a courageous man. I bank with PNB. And I hear people say when I visit the branches, and I tell them, why is your service so poor now? He says, no, that guy is a New Bank of India guy. The merger happened 20 years ago. He says, that guy is a New Bank of India guy. That's why he's doing what he's doing. I have nothing against the New Bank of India. Maybe the way they approach work was different. I don't think merger is the answer, nor is merger going to be easy to do. There was a time when you could have done it. When you had 100% ownership of a large number of banks, nobody to ask questions, you should have merged banks. There's no reason why government should be the majority shareholder of 20 or 21 banks. There's simply no need. You go to some of the smaller towns, on a single street, you have 4 or 5 branch offices, all of which are of banks where the government is the majority owner. Why should government compete against itself for business? There's no reason why it should. So you need the system to be cleaned up. Does the political element in the executive have the courage to drive that process? That is what Vikram is urging. He says we need to do that. If that doesn't happen, nothing will. But I wanted to also mention one thing in the context of the banking sector, which is when the banks were nationalized, and when we look back now, we can find hundreds of faults with it. But there was one proposition, which is that you moved away, or you said you were moving away, from creditworthiness of person to creditworthiness of purpose. So if the poor man had a creditworthy proposal, he could, theoretically at least, go to a bank. In the days of connected lending and behest lending, you could not. No bank would talk to you or give you the time of day. Theoretically, at least, that was the first step towards inclusive banking in this country. The jury is still out on whether it was a good thing to do or a bad thing to do.
Yes, sir.
Hi, quite an interesting discussion, and I just want to understand from you guys, how can we bring the courage in the independent directors to take the right action? Like if I see from the last year Infosys case and now Axis and ICICI Bank, I see a lot of independent directors not taking the courage to come out and really tell the people like what really needs to be happening in the banks or these corporates. Do you think that independent directors are forgetting the roles for which they are actually being over there? Like what's your view on these?
Vikram?
You know, I get asked this question quite often, and I have only one answer, and it's an honest, personal answer. I think the role of the independent director should not be just generalized and put within the framework of rules. There are very clear rules. We have a very clear fiduciary responsibility. The sanctions against us if we don't fulfill those responsibilities are also very explicit and tough. But you're absolutely right. Not every independent director is independent or behaves independently. Why? I don't know about others. I can only talk about myself. I believe I am truly independent because that is in conformity with my values. I think ultimately the independence of the individual who sits on the board is going to be determined by whether or not he feels a moral obligation and a personal obligation to actually exercise his fiduciary responsibility responsibly. And if he does not, there are many, many incentives for him to ignore it. He can get paid a very high commission, that's an incentive. He can be, he does not want to necessarily upset his relationship with the promoter or with the chairman, that can be an incentive. There are many incentives. And most of us who are independent directors, remember, are retired. We have had our career, we have spent 30 years, and so this is kind of a second life for us. And we are saying, okay, why, we'll hang around there, we'll get our commission, we'll get our director's fees, and we'll carry on. Now, if that's your attitude towards this particular new life of yours, then you will not be independent. But if you, as I say, believe that you have a responsibility, and that belief will only come if your value system, your own personal value system, actually is empathetic, is in line with that belief, then I think you will get a very different cadre of independence.
Though I will say that the job of an independent director is also not easy. You spend some 50, 80 hours a year, and you are expected to know everything that is going on. I mean, the realism around how much time you need to spend as an independent director to actually not be ignorant. Because if you're independent, you are likely to be more ignorant about that company because you're not from inside. And then if you're ignorant, you can't be particularly useful. So how you draw that mix is also non-trivial, in trying to actually be an independent director. So the fact that company managements also have to actually live to a higher standard cannot easily be ignored. And the fact is that the biggest problem I find in India is that you can have rules, but you find it hard to actually convict people, and when you convict them, to actually jail them. And so that entire process makes for really no real sanction when things go wrong. And we really need to keep that also in mind. Last question, sir.
A brief comment, if I may. I don't think you should tar all independent directors with the same brush. There are an increasing number of independent directors who, for whatever reason, companies like 2013, Satyam, whatever, are actually asking the right questions in boards, are pushing back, are telling management, sorry, we're not convinced with your proposal. You want me to give names? I can give names. Vikram and I sit on a board together, and I can certify that Vikram is as independent as you can get on a board, since I see him, I sit opposite him in the board. So I know that there are independent directors who ask tough questions and who will not step back if the answer is not appropriate. That's happening in boardrooms. The examples that you gave, unfortunately, are of boards and directors that many of us thought, I did not, that many of us thought were beyond reproach, were a superior class of human beings. And there were people who were walking around as if their middle names were corporate governance. They were treated as holy cows. You know, when there are that kind of failures, I think Shakespeare had the correct answer. He said, when beggars die, there are no comets seen. The heavens themselves blaze forth the death of princes. That's why you're seeing the big failures in bold relief. There are smaller companies which are doing reasonably well, thank God for that.
I think that brings us to the end of our allocated time. So thank you so much. It was an after lunch session, and I still hope. Actually, I don't see so many people asleep, so I think we at least succeeded in that. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentlemen, if you could just give us 2 minutes, we need to take a polling. So ladies and gentlemen, you have keypads on your table. Kindly switch them on, and let's move on to the question. The House is open for polling. Can we have the question, please? Can fewer rules and less human interface ensure better governance? The options are option A for yes and option B for no. So if you can lock in your option by pressing the option and then press OK, 30 more seconds, and we'll get to see the result. Can fewer rules and less human interface ensure better governance? A for yes and B for no. Okay, there you go. The results. 56.67% say yes and 43.3% say no. With that being said, let's have a huge round of applause. I would request Minister of Commerce, High Commission of Canada, Mr. Brian Parrott, to kindly grace the stage and present a summit memoir to our esteemed group of panelists. Can we have a round of applause for Sir? First and foremost, Mr. Vikram Mehta. Come on, we can do better. Let's have a bigger round of applause, please. Thank you. Up next, Mr. M. Damodaran. And for our moderator, Mr. Janmejaya Sinha. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, sir. If you could all please join us for a group photograph.